Hello, Glitter Conference. Welcome to our presentation, When Wikipedia is Perfect and Fake News is Fine, Considering Rhetorical Situation and Source Evaluation. My name is Brandy Horne. I'm an Instruction and Reference Librarian and Associate Professor at the Greg Granville Library at the University of South Carolina.
I'm Amanda Warren, and I'm a member of the English Department at the University of South Carolina, Aiken. I'm a former Writing Center Director at USCA, and my area of study and expertise are composition, creative, professional, and technical writing. Today we're here to discuss a modification to the ubiquitous CRAAP test for source evaluation that includes an additional consideration, that of rhetorical situation.
As an academic librarian, my primary goal is to help students become more sophisticated information consumers. So as far as this statement, the word sophisticated here is kind of important in this context, because I feel like students need to understand that the world of information is more nuanced and complex than oftentimes we teach them to look at it. It's not a black or white thing. It's not like good sources and bad sources. It's very like a lot of different shades of gray. So again, I want them to be more sophisticated in how they approach information and how they decide what to use in their research projects.
So as a writing instructor, my primary goal is to help our students improve their critical thinking skills, which includes information literacy, and to understand their choices as writers. And those choices can have a wide range, stemming from everything from source selection to individual word choice and description, formality. All sorts of things can create an effective piece of writing versus an ineffective piece of writing. So I need them to understand, and going back to Brandy's word, sophistication, need to understand what their choices are so that they can make those more sophisticated choices more quickly and more easily.
Oh, this is me. Why expand a reliable method of assessment? So going back to our original proposal that we would like to modify the CRAAP test, common source evaluation tools such as PATS, if you've worked with that before, or CRAAP, help students assess sources of information based on considerations specific to the source itself, like looking at the particular thing. So looking at the purpose of it, looking at authority, like who's responsible for it, when it was published, so timeliness and currency, scope and relevance to the topic, and accuracy. What these tools don't consider is the source's appropriateness within the different rhetorical situations. So the different types of assignments or the way that it might be used. So by teaching students to consider a source's potential appropriateness within different rhetorical contexts, like in an opinion paper versus a research paper, or maybe using it as a primary source versus a secondary source, we provide students a framework for more meaningful source evaluation and a means by which to articulate how, why, and when sources are used.
So rhetorical situation is a cornerstone or center of my teaching in composition classroom, particularly with early students, but this goes throughout all levels of composition and writing courses that I teach. Rhetorical situation is the context of any piece of communication, be it written or oral or visual in some way. So it's the situation we find ourselves in regarding why we're saying something at all, what we have to say, and who we're trying to communicate with. So it's the purpose, message, and audience for our work. Other factors come into play as well. Things like scope and length and time frame are part of the situation as well. So identifying rhetorical situation or context for a piece of writing allows us to make decisions about our writing style, format, word choice, content, description, organization, source selection, source use, which is different, evidence, all of it. Without an understanding of these three things, we as writers are unable to proceed, or at least it is difficult to proceed. There are certain expectations for communicating within specific context or rhetorical situations. Maybe those expectations have to do with formatting or organization. Maybe they have to do with our goals. Are we trying to prove or explain something? Are we trying to entertain? Those are different rhetorical situations. Maybe they dictate, these situations, the appropriateness of specific types of source material, how sources are synthesized or used, and how to appropriately document those sources. So making good authorial choices means understanding those expectations, and understanding those expectations, for me in my classroom, means that thinking deliberately about rhetorical situation. So I'm going to break down some of these elements. So the first element of rhetorical situation is you, as a human, your purpose for communication. This is the why. The perspective you communicate from. Are you a member of a community, a member of a club, a business person, an employee, a son, a daughter, a parent, a sibling, and what is your relationship? Are you a boss writing to employees, or are you an employee writing to your boss? Those are different contexts in rhetorical situations. So this helps define the context of the communication, just identifying your space within this communication. What is it that you bring to a situation? The context, your stance, which is influenced by your life situation and experiences or your familiarity with previous work on that topic. But actively considering purpose means reflecting on why you're composing this particular bit of communication. And as I said, there are a lot of different rhetorical situations. Are you a professional in a professional office setting writing a memo? Are you in front of a city council arguing against a city development project? Are you a student who's been given an assignment? And is that assignment a lab report, a poem explication, or a sociology capstone project? Each of these things helps us make choices as writers a little bit more efficiently, a little bit more effectively, but it also dictates what sort of sources are going to be effective as well. So the second aspect of rhetorical situation is the message or topic. This is what you choose to communicate about. Even when a student is given an assignment, a lot of the topic or message of that writing is left up to them. What do you want to say? That's your topic or message. Are you for or against increasing minimum wage nationally? Are you arguing that Wikipedia is a valid source for university-level research? Are you arguing that it's a resource but not a source? Are you criticizing or defending ownership of exotic animals? Are you writing a historical novel and you want it to be super accurate? Are you investigating the rhetoric of pro- and anti-vaccination websites to determine keywords and arguments to come to some conclusion about that rhetoric? Are you constructing an argument about the regional variations in contemporary hip-hop lyrics and sampling? Each of these situations, these messages or topics, demands different primary, secondary, and perhaps even tertiary sources of us. And some of them aren't the kinds of sources we might expect in an academic paper, but that doesn't mean that they're not useful. I also want to note that we don't have to worry always about starting a communication project with a solid position. We often need information before deciding on that stance, and sometimes we don't even really need a stance at all if we're focused on crafting an informational piece rather than an argumentative or analytical one. So that message, that topic, that purpose, all connected. The next important thing, and this seems to be one of the most important things when it comes to my writing and what I teach students, is audience. You have to know who your audience is and what they expect of you. This helps determine what your target reader may already know and what challenges you might be facing. Knowing your audience helps you make choices about structure, types of examples and descriptions, source selection and use, and even word choice. So talking to a group of third graders is not the same as talking to a group of police detectives. You're going to use different language, you're going to use different evidence. A group of concerned PTA moms is not the same as a group of teens attending a concert. So if you're doing that paper on rap lyrics, you may have a few more challenges talking to the PTA moms about the value of those lyrics. So how we say something clearly and convincingly to a group of people will change even when our message and purpose is the same. And included upon that, how we argue convincingly has to do with our source and evidence selection. Other considerations that can factor, not always, but can factor into a rhetorical situation are things like scope, length of paper, time frame. This applies a lot to academic assignments. So another factor is access to libraries and sources. Those can influence the choices we make as well. If we don't have access to a certain kind of source at all, then we're going to have to choose different sources. A lengthy, in-depth piece of research writing, like a thesis, dissertation, or professional publication, is going to allow someone more time to investigate and discuss the nuances of a topic, while a 2-page overview may only touch on surface details or provide a summary. And as I said, limited library or database access can also affect our potential sources. So these are sort of external considerations that have to do with time and access.
All right, so looking at our proposed modification to the CRAAP test, I think I'd be lying if I didn't admit that part of the appeal of this was the fact that we were changing it to crappers. And so hence our little toilet illustration there. Anyway, so modification to the CRAAP test to include rhetorical situation as one of the elements to consider when evaluating information. The CRAAP test originally was created by the California State University Chico Merriam Library, and that's been widely adopted and adapted across, as far as I know, higher ed just in general. It's a very popular test. And it's easy to remember because it's CRAAP and people think that's funny. So looking at what we've got here, we've got the basic CRAAP test plus the rhetorical situation element at the bottom. Currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, purpose, and then rhetorical situation. And just a quick review, obviously currency is the basically publication date of something. If what you're researching, if that's an important detail to pay attention to, then question is ask yourself, when was it published or last updated? Is there another source that might provide more current information like statistics? If you're looking at statistics that are 20 years old, maybe find something that is doing the same thing but updated maybe in the last several years. Relevance, is it relevant to your topic? Does that help you understand your topic better? Does it help you answer your research question? Authority, who's responsible for the information? Is it a person? Is it an organization? What are their credentials? Is there any potential conflict of interest? Just information or details to pay attention to. Accuracy, this can be a little harder because if you're not an expert in the field, you don't necessarily know. But if it's something like a peer-reviewed article or research produced by a government agency, you're probably pretty safe. Looking at the evidence that they provide, the sources that they cite, to see if that seems solid. Can the information be verified elsewhere? Are other sources saying the same thing? Purpose, why was this particular piece written? And, as Dr. Horne was talking about, mentioned earlier, like purpose for us in writing as well. Like, was it created to inform, educate, entertain? Is this satire? Was it written to convince you of something or to sell you something? Or is it something out there intentionally to mislead, misinformation or malinformation or anything like that? So what is the purpose of this particular thing? And then once you've gone through and kind of looked at your source from all these different perspectives, thinking about how would you use this in your research? What is your research project? How would you use this? Are you using it as a primary source, as a secondary source? Is it a tertiary source? Does it present specific perspectives that you plan to discuss? What is it about the source that you feel like you're going to use, or how you're going to use it in your research project? Because ultimately, none of these elements are a deal breaker, right? Even if there is like bias or something in the source or is trying to convince you of something, if you're writing a paper that's an argumentative paper, your paper has bias. So if you include sources that are biased, that's to be expected, right? So if it's something that was published a long time ago, that could be perfectly fine. If you're looking at like foundational or hallmark works, like the first time a theory was published or something like that, where you need to pull that in as a reference point, or you're working in subjects where having more recent information is not necessary. Is not necessary. Again, none of these elements in and of themselves, if there's like a negative evaluation, none of them are necessarily deal breakers. It's just however you're going to discuss it or how you're going to use it in your paper, how you're going to present it. So examples, different types of writing require different types of sources.
I'll start with the blog post. So I have an assignment with my students where they are asked to pull a strange topic out of what we call the can of mystery. Mm-hmm. And most of these topics are ghost stories and sort of unusual things. Urban legends, cryptids are a big thing. So what they're asked to do is, for the first part of this assignment, create just an informational article. And so for that purpose, this is an informational blog post that was shared on a class blog. They're synthesizing information from other sources. And so they're looking at Wikipedia first as a resource, and sometimes even as a source. Books on cryptids, which in an academic setting we normally wouldn't think of as valid sources. You know, let's go find a Strange Things of South Carolina book, or Ghosts of Texas. That's a big favorite. So these books aren't necessarily academic. They're definitely not peer-reviewed. The blog posts that they will bring in sometimes as sources, you know, people who have firsthand, and I'm putting that in some air quotes for you, firsthand accounts of local hauntings, like local and regional news and comments on ghost hunting sites. Normally, these would not be seen as valid sources according to that CRAAP test, but because the rhetorical situation is added to this and they can explain how they're going to use this, these become valid sources, and sources that are not only acceptable but actually crucial. I want to know what the lizard man of Scape or Swamp was described as, and that is available in a local or regional news source.
Yeah.
So that's important. So it's not just that, okay, I'll accept that. It's that we actually need to know the firsthand accounts. So using those as primary sources is extraordinarily effective. Now, later on, they do have to expand this project to do an analysis of these topics. And those analyses tend to be pretty strange. So they're not only including the sort of sources they might use for the blog post, they start to incorporate secondary sources that have to do with psychology or sociology, and really interesting ways to examine why people might believe in these strange things.
Another example may be an argumentative paper where you're trying to convince somebody of something. Maybe a topic like, should the federal government pursue more gun control measures? The kind of information that you would include in that. Peer-reviewed research, if at all, if that's ever appropriate, always go for that. But then also government information, things from government websites, actual current legislation, anything else that's available, any studies or anything like that that might be there. But also things like op-eds and commentary where other people are making these arguments in newspapers and magazines, websites that have think pieces and things like that. Any of this could be valid for that type of paper.
Another example might be a research paper that does a sociolinguistic study of political bias in reporting. And in that case, you're going to want to use both far left liberal sites and far right conservative sites as primary source examples of the language that you're discussing. So you want to have that primary source material. Now, normally these things are, both of these sites are extremely biased. But recognizing that bias and looking at the language is important for a project like this. And pairing that with peer-reviewed research that may also be investigating that same thing is a way to create a balance, and to look at the actual language of those sites is super important. So limiting yourself and excluding those things because they wouldn't normally fit into the sort of source evaluation structure that is encouraged. Adding that rhetorical situation makes these more accessible, makes these more appropriate. Thank you. That was the word I was looking for.
Another example, informational essays. Maybe you want to look at the public reaction or response to something like a presidential debate or some other kind of event that lots of people would have watched. And so again, you might go to far liberal sites or far left liberal sites or far right conservative sites and look at whatever articles being published and look at the comment sections under that. You might go to YouTube where a video of the thing has been posted and look at the comments under that, and then kind of gather all those comments and sort through them and code them and categorize them. And then in your paper, you might say like, all of the responses, we found there were pretty much 5 different themes. And then, quote one of those comments and be like, this is an example of, this is an example of this particular type of theme, right? Or this is an example of this. So you're not using like Starshine 47's quote in your paper as an authoritative source. You're using it as just an example of a particular theme or something that you've identified in your research, gathering all of this primary source material, all this raw data, and just presenting it in your paper that way. So again, it's all about how you contextualize the information. You're not presenting it as authoritative or factual or true, but you're showing using it to again show public reaction to something, like an example of that. So in that context, that's appropriate. That's perfectly appropriate to use. All right. Evaluating information in terms of academic research, and as I've kind of said, we're emphasizing that in terms of academic research, information isn't inherently good or bad. We tend to talk to students about good information versus bad information, good sources versus good sources, or good sources versus bad sources. But the thing is, it is more nuanced than that. It really does depend on what their research project is and how they're going to use it, how they're going to present the information, how they contextualize it within their paper. So while tools like the CRAAP test or modified CRAAPers highlight specific aspects of information for evaluation, a negative evaluation in any of those categories, like I mentioned before, isn't necessarily a deal breaker. If there's bias, if it's an older source, if there is a potential conflict of interest, doesn't mean you can't use the information. You just need to be thoughtful about how you're going to use it and how you're going to handle it appropriately in your paper or in your research project. So appropriateness of information depends on the context in which it's presented. So giving some examples of things that we might think of as bad sources and when they might be appropriate to use, we have it broken down into primary, secondary, and tertiary, because a lot of times it really comes down to this. Is it a primary source? Is it kind of the information that you're analyzing and like pulling conclusions from? Is it secondary? And then tertiary, wondering how or looking at how you're going to use it, and what kind of information you're getting from it. So maybe like a far right website like Breitbart. We talked about the sociolinguistic study of bias. Maybe you're going to go to that website as one of your examples for that, one of your primary sources, and you're going to analyze the language. You're going to analyze how topics are framed and discussed. You're going to analyze what they decide to cover, right? So you're going to go to Breitbart and you're going to look at these things. Potentially from a secondary perspective, looking at conservative perspectives on current events, like what are their views and their arguments, how are they reacting to things? So, as commentary on something else, you could look at it in that way as well.
Okay, so the Weekly World News, which touts itself as the world's most trusted news source, I don't know if everybody's familiar with us. They are the world's foremost authority on Bat Boy and a couple of other creatures. This is humor to a point, satire to a point. People do take it seriously, but it is very much fake news. And it's very self-aware fake news. I wouldn't call it, I would say there is a lot of humor in satire. It's not The Onion, but it's pretty close, and it deals with a lot of like paranormal and extraterrestrial and unknown type things. Now, as a primary source, this would be perfect for the example that I gave earlier of that blog post on cryptids. Absolutely perfect source as a primary source. Now, as a secondary or tertiary source, I don't know that I could find a way for this to be an appropriate source for most situations, but there may be some situations in which this could be a completely appropriate source as a primary, secondary, or tertiary, depending on the rhetorical situation of that project.
One of the examples that I will use in class sometimes to talk about how the line can be blurred between good information and bad information is things like climate change research. You've got a lot of research out there produced by lots of different entities, and some of those entities are the oil companies themselves or the energy companies themselves. So ExxonMobil has an entire section of their website on research that they've sponsored or conducted or whatnot, and those papers are available. So obviously there's a conflict of interest, right? Because they have a specific outcome that they would like to see happen, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that the stuff that they publish is not usable as a source. It depends, again, on how you contextualize it. So if you wanted to, say, compare climate change research that was sponsored by oil companies versus climate change research that's associated just with like universities, and see if the data is the same, see if they're collecting the same data, if they're interpreting it the same way and presenting it the same way, or look for the potential differences between like research based on sponsorship, basically. Or as secondary, just looking at it for climate change data, right, and see what's there. Again, you could say, talk in terms of like, research conducted by ExxonMobil shows this, while research conducted by such and such a place shows this, da, da, da. So again, you can primary and secondary source, as primary, secondary sources, you could use it as long as you disclose where it came from. Again, not relevant as tertiary, but, could be used in these other contexts.
So Wikipedia is the site that every academic loves to hate. I know a lot of English teachers who are like, never use Wikipedia. But there are situations, rhetorical situations, in which Wikipedia is not only appropriate, but necessary. So say a student is creating an argument on the use of Wikipedia in research papers. They would want to see what Wikipedia has to say about that. So that is using Wikipedia, and Wikipedia's data, which they're very good at. As far as like sort of pros of Wikipedia, they have so much data and metadata available. So going to that site and using it as a primary source seems absolutely appropriate and almost crucial if you're talking about something like that. So looking at the accuracy and timeliness of Wikipedia articles, looking at doing an analysis of quality of the sources cited. So there are a lot of ways when Wikipedia can be used as a primary source, as a way to discuss things. As a secondary source, my suggestion to students is always, if you find something that looks like a secondary source on Wikipedia, you go to those sources themselves. So Wikipedia is then, as a secondary source, a resource, not a source. Now, as far as a tertiary source, Wikipedia is an encyclopedia, and it is actually pretty factual. If you're looking for basic factual information, it's a constantly updated source. So oftentimes those will have more timely information than perhaps a print source might. So I encourage like Wikipedia as a basic factual information source. Now, whether or not we cite basic factual information in particularly in MLA, not really. If it's basic factual information that can be found in a wide variety of sources, you don't cite it anyway. But Wikipedia can be used in a lot of different ways depending on your rhetorical situation.
And if nothing else, Wikipedia is accessible to most people in the
Absolutely.
in the terms of the language that's used in it and its availability. And so it's a less threatening, and it's, if you are talking about a specific theory or philosophy or something, sometimes you can find the language of that to be more accessible in Wikipedia rather than going to the actual source of the book where it came from and, all that kind of thing that seems more intimidating or scarier. So using Wikipedia in that context could be helpful. And then the final example here, comment sections, because this is another one of the things that I like to use. And I talked about this a little bit ago. Sometimes you can look at things like comment sections under newspaper articles, under YouTube videos, or other things like that, to explore the public reaction to something or public perception of something. And you can pull those into your paper and pull in specific quotes just as kind of illustrative examples of, different themes that you've identified. So, this is just like a sampling of a few things that would generally not be considered appropriate for academic research, but the context in which they would be appropriate. And I realize that across the board, all of these we list as primary, because ultimately anything can be used as a primary source, right? If you're analyzing it and you're discussing it, it's a primary source. So if nothing else, most anything can be used in that context. It gets a little trickier when you start talking about secondary and whatnot. But again, we want students to be thinking about not just like those specific elements like timeliness and scope and whatnot of the information that they're looking at, but also thinking about how they're going to use it appropriately. One of the things that Dr. Horne mentioned, like just in a list earlier, was like sociological research methods like capstone papers. We do have a sociological research methods obviously on campus. And one of the things that the students struggle with, even though they have to just use peer-reviewed sources, they have to find 25 peer-reviewed sources, which is a lot of research. It's a lot of stuff that they have to find and then weave it together into this literature review. And a lot of times they're not articulating how the sources they're using actually are relevant to their topic. Like they feel like they are, but they're not making that case very well in the paper. So you're looking at rhetorical situation in all these other contexts and forcing students to be mindful about how they're using information and what aspect of it is like, what actually contributes to this? How can I use it appropriately? I think will help them develop those skills that they will need in assignments like that capstone paper, where you have to not just like find 25 sources, but then pull it together into a cohesive thing and provide like synthesis and discussion. I think that this is kind of foundational to developing those types of skills that they'll use later on in their upper level classes. And that is what we have. Here are our sources that you can refer back to. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact us. Here are our email addresses. And yeah, thank you for listening to us. And I hope you have a great day and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks so much.
Bye.